And so I'm going to talk about an approach that's been labeled as the one planet approach. And it's not clear to me. There we go. Okay, never mind. So this slide illustrates sort of what you might call the traditional approach to species conservation, which is that different groups, certainly different in situ groups versus ex situ groups, often manage or plan for their conservation actions independently. So while the wildlife managers, the field biologists, SSC specialist groups, and others might be developing a conservation strategy or an action plan, a recovery plan for the wild populations, zoos and aquariums and other conservation breeding centers are individually or separately developing their programs for how they're going to be managing the species and even which species they manage. And occasionally, but not very often, there's some collaboration between the two groups at the bottom. That is, that there is discussion of the sort that Christine was just talking about how to make the ex situ population really serve the needs of the in situ population, identifying those roles, identifying who can do that work. But that hasn't traditionally been done in wildlife management. And in fact, in some ways, the situation is even worse than this, in that within each of these boxes, there often is not as much collaboration as there needs to be. So often NGOs versus government agencies versus academics and versus landowners and other stakeholders all have essentially their own conservation strategies that they're pursuing, their own plans that they're acting on without a lot of discussion with the others. And on the right-hand side, different zoo and aquarium associations or even different individual zoos or breeding centers often have their own plans without a lot of collaboration between them. So the idea of the one planet approach is we need to end that. We need to have a single integrated conservation plan for each species that we care about. And therefore, we need to involve both the in situ conservation community and the ex situ conservation community from the beginning, so up top, to come up with one integrated conservation strategy. And therefore, we have a conservation plan for the in situ population. And that conservation plan, that same plan describes the uses and the roles and the methodologies that will be used for ex situ conservation activities that might be needed, with the common goal, of course, of having a viable in situ population, if not now, at least as soon in the future as we possibly can. And all of this is probably something that you would see as straightforward and obvious, especially to many of you who work in these different areas of conservation. But I'll point out that as obvious as it might be, we often don't do it. And therefore, I think we really need to think about how we're going to sometimes change the way we go about our business if we're going to be successful in conservation. And that's the whole strategy or the philosophy behind the one plan approach. So the one plan approach is defined as an integrated conservation planning process for a species, both inside and outside its natural range, under all conditions of management. That is, you look at all the different populations that may exist of that species, whether they're natural areas, in protected reserves, in zoos and aquariums, in universities, wherever they might be, and look at every population of the species and every group that has responsibility for those populations and the resources they can bring to the table to produce one comprehensive conservation plan that looks at the roles of each of those populations in an overall strategy. So this slide just shows essentially what we think about with respect to the overall one plan approach. And we take a look at all the populations simultaneously, and we do that as a comprehensive conservation plan instead of each of these separate units managing their populations in isolation or at least close to being in isolation. So obviously species conservation is difficult. We know that there are many different threats to species at primary and secondary levels, as Christine was talking about. And we also know that these threats are very diverse. It's not just they're all genetic threats or just disease threats or just habitat threats, but very wide array of threats facing species. And they interact in very complex ways, so that the genetic threats can interact with the environmental threats, can interact with the disease threats, etc. And therefore, many different kinds of conservation actions are, of course, needed. And therefore, many people and organizations need to be involved. And that's something that we tend to lose sight of all too often. The important thing is also that we can't fail. If we fail to make the best use of our resources and all the kinds of populations, all the kinds of conservation strategies that are necessary, we're going to lose species, and that's not what we want to have happening. And therefore, it really does not make sense for different groups working on conservation of species to be following different plans, different work plans for the species. There should be a common plan for the species that identifies the work being done by each of the organizations or each of the partners involved. And we all too often do not do that. So as an example, the kinds of conservation that need to be considered and the kinds of conservation needs that might be identified. Obviously, governments will be involved, non-governmental organizations, local communities in the area where the habitat is. Zoos can be involved, academic researchers and teachers can be involved. Often many of these involvements go through the local community. And there would be even more arrows than this on this table. I just didn't have enough room to put them all in. And given all these crossing of lines, it's important to recognize that a big challenge will be coordinating all of this. So in fact, one of the species conservation needs that some of the organizations can fill is a coordination need, the need to bring different partners together in a collaborative process to make sure this all works in a compatible way, in order to produce one comprehensive species conservation plan for that species. So these are just some of the partners that would be involved in a typical one plan approach. And as you can look through here, they all seem obvious. It's also clear that often conservation planning is done leaving some of these groups out of the picture. And that's the kind of process, outcome we need to avoid. So what's required for one plan approach? Well, first of all, together with all these different partners, we need to determine what are the priority species to focus on. We need to develop a conservation strategy together. We need to identify what tasks need to be accomplished, who can fill which roles, and how it will all be coordinated and communicated. So a few thoughts about what a one plan approach isn't. First of all, it's not one organization mandating a conservation plan that everybody else has to follow. And that's probably the approach to a one plan approach that some of the organizations, some of us would like to follow if we could, that we could dictate what's going to happen, everyone else does it. Instead, it's a plan that brings together the multiple partners so that they together determine what's needed and determine what roles each will have. It's also, as Christine was talking about, not a process that always requires in situ conservation, education, etc., and ex situ conservation. Sometimes you do need a big long-term capture program that's essential to prevent extinction. Sometimes a short-term program is adequate, and sometimes no capture program is needed at all. And I will point out that since the one plan approach arose from partly the zoo community working with the IUCN's Conservation Planning Specialist Group, there is a perception out there that one plan approach is primarily focused on getting zoos involved in field conservation or having the important role of zoos recognized. And that's not really what it is. It's not a matter of trying to insert zoos into the picture. It's a matter of deciding who needs to be in the picture, what their roles would be, and decide who doesn't need to be in the picture. It's also obviously not one strategy or one plan that's going to be applied to all species. It needs to be very species specific. It needs to respond to our goals for that species, the threats to those goals, and what opportunities we have to address those threats, the kinds of things that Christine was just talking about. So the question is, how is this any different from what zoos did in the past? So as I said, the one plan approach arose out of some discussions within the zoo community. So why is it any different? Well, it is the case that in the past, and still sometimes, zoo associations often selected species for conservation programs without outside help from other organizations. In other words, they went it alone instead of bringing groups, academic researchers, field biologists, government entities, and others to help decide which species should be selected for the programs in zoos. The zoo committees sat around and talked to themselves to decide what would go into their programs. And that's really not what we want to have happening. It's also the case, and Christine referred to this, that the past perception was that the zoo breeding programs, the XC2 programs, tend to be characterized as trying to build a large, long-term, genetically diverse breeding program for every species. And I will admit that perhaps I'm even partly at fault for this, because a lot of my own research was focused on how to manage a captive breeding program that is going to be long-term, genetically diverse, and large. And therefore, in providing the tools for doing that kind of work, I think we've often overlooked the fact that XC2 programs can often serve other needs, as Christine was talking about. It's also the case that if you look at the conservation plans, the regional population plans, other sorts of plans that many zoo associations have developed, it's rather hard to see the connection between some of those programs and what the conservation strategy is for the species in the wild. That is, there's a disconnect between the kind of planning that was done for which species need to be within the zoo programs and which species in the wild needed the help in various ways of those XC2 programs. And how is the One Planet project different from what conservation organizations, both NGOs and government organizations, did in the past? Well, in the past, it was the case that most wildlife agencies, conservation NGOs, and zoos developed their plans without consulting with each other. But not only did zoos not ask the expertise from the field biologists and the government authorities and others to help with identifying programs to focus on, but the reverse happened. Wildlife agencies, conservation NGOs, the other partners out there in conservation, or organizations that should be partners, often develop plans without ever asking the zoos what role they might have in the program, or asking the educators, or asking the researchers, and on down the line. It's also the case that some of the not only unnecessary but sort of damaging separation of efforts wasn't just between organizations, but has occurred between disciplines or fields of study. So often specialists in various fields pursue their analyses in isolation from each other. And that is, for example, you can see it illustrated by the fact that often wildlife veterinarians focus on what they can do for a species and what the disease risks are, while the geneticists start talking about genetic problems a species might be having and how to manage the genetics. And of course, people focus on law enforcement, have their own priorities and their methodologies, land management, etc. And these groups don't talk to each other. They develop separate plans for how to deal with disease, or how to deal with genetic risks, or how to deal with habitat destruction, or poaching efforts, or whatever it might be. And that's really the wrong way to go about it. We're going to have unnecessary efforts taking place and unnecessarily uncoordinated efforts if these specialists don't start talking with each other. And that's especially true if you think back to Christine's slide about the kinds of threats that face species, because often the health problems, the genetic problems, the poaching problems, the landscape problems, and the others all interact in very complex ways. You can't solve one of these without solving the others. And as I pointed out before, often the in situ conservation efforts ignored what the ex situ programs might offer, just in the same way the ex situ conservation efforts often ignore how they fit into the in situ conservation programs. And as Christine emphasized very well, in the past, very little thought was given to what would be the role of each program in the overall conservation strategy for the species. And this is true of the role of the captive programs, the role of protected wildlife areas, national parks, reserves, etc., and the role of populations outside of protection. So the key question that I think we need to keep asking ourselves when we start to develop a plan, a conservation plan for species, is what are the necessary and the sufficient actions that will be needed to counter the threats and achieve a conservation goal for the species. And this should seem obvious, but I think all too often we end up not addressing all the actions that are necessary, but only some of them, the ones that first come to mind, and often taking on actions that aren't necessary, that are or not necessary for protecting the species. And I'll give you just one example of the kind of lack of thinking on these lines that sometimes happens, at least here in the US, and maybe in some of your countries as well. One species that I'm working with in one wildlife agency, and I won't name them to protect them, has spent, they estimated, $100 million over the past decade on habitat purchases and habitat restoration efforts for an endangered species. They admitted, however, after spending $100 million on habitat protection and restoration, that they had never done the analyses to determine whether they're buying the right habitat, enough habitat, restoring it in the correct ways, or maybe protecting more than is needed. So they never analyzed whether what they were doing was necessary or not to protect the species in a rigorous way. They never looked at whether what they were doing was sufficient, whether maybe they need to do more. And yet they've spent $100 million on that program over the past decade. And that's just foolish. We can't keep doing that if we're going to wisely use our conservation resources and successfully protect species. So once you identify what are the necessary actions that are needed and what is sufficient, we need to identify who can fill each role in that process. So with respect to translocations, not just amphibians, but other things, we need to think a little bit about what the one plan approach would mean for planning for translocations. And one thing it means is that from the initial planning, we need to involve the species biologists, of course, those that know how to, the biology of the species and how to manage it. The field biologists, those that know the habitat and what's happening there, has to be managed there. Governmental agencies that need to be involved, the breeding centers that might need to be involved, translocation experts who have expertise in general in translocation, not just for these species, disease experts, so those who know what kinds of disease risks and how you can mitigate those risks exist, and the local communities in the area where you're going to do the translocation. I'm sure all of you are well aware that these are the kinds of groups that need to be involved in any discussion of potential translocations for species conservation. I think that initial word is important. And that is, all too often, some of these groups dive into planning a translocation program or a release program without involving the others. And therefore, they essentially can come up with a plan that either is inadequate, or maybe not necessary, or at least isn't well coordinated with other actions that take place with respect to those translocations. So our tendency, I know my tendency and probably everybody's tendency, is to jump to conclusions about what we can do, start doing it, and then later think about bringing in other partners to the discussions. And we need to turn that around and bring in the other partners from the beginning. So in terms of what it would mean for translocations, we need to do that prior analysis involving our many partners. We need to do habitat assessments. We need to do genetic analyses. We need to do disease risk assessments. And we need to analyze the viability of the source population from which we're going to be drawing the animals, whether it's an in situ population or another wild population. We need to analyze the viability or project the viability of the recipient population. And this is probably especially true if you're going to be translocating individuals into an existing population rather than reintroducing them to a place where they don't currently exist. You need to assess the risks that could be faced by that recipient population and balance that against the benefits. And even if they're going to be reintroduced to a site that doesn't currently have the species, we probably ought to bring in biologists and other stakeholders who are involved with other species in that area. One thing, of course, we don't want to do is to do a very cleverly planned reintroduction program or even assisted migration or assisted translocation program, and by doing so, help the species we're working on and devastate others. Of course, that could happen. So we do need to evaluate the uncertainties and risks. We need to be honest with ourselves about what we know and what we don't know, what risks might be involved. We need to bring in multiple partners who would know about the kinds of risks that we might not know about. So I don't know much at all about wildlife diseases. So if I was going to plan a translocation, rather than just focusing on the genetics and the population biology, I ought to bring into the room some wildlife disease experts with that group of species and say, what don't I know that I need to know? And what do I know that you need to know? So you need to also go through projections. So not just sort of evaluate the risks and the benefits and where we think we'll be and what we can do, but really work through the numbers in detail of how many individuals are going to be taken from this first population? Is it sustainable? How many will be added to the recipient populations? Will that be enough to make the difference to succeed in conservation? And I'll just keep emphasizing this. All this needs to be done with the multiple stakeholders and the diverse expertise in the room. And by in the room, I mean that in a sense, in a figurative sense, that they need to be involved, and maybe that's through internet connections or other discussions or exchanges of information in various ways. I will point out that often it's really valuable to have them literally in the room. That is, when you're sitting down face to face working with the partners from other kinds of expertise and other kinds of concerns, you often learn a lot more than you learn just trying to exchange a few email messages or trading some publications or other reports. As a few examples of good examples of one plan approach, the Red Siskin Initiative in Venezuela is a project that is really an international partnership of diverse organizations and kinds of people to make sure that the research that is needed is done, that the birds are produced that are needed for translocation and reintroduction programs, and that the people in the local communities have the appropriate roles so they can both assist rather than damage the conservation efforts. So these are just some of the organizations involved in the Red Siskin Initiative, everything from government organizations in Venezuela and the US and Guyana, to zoological organizations, to NGOs like Provita and Conservation Society, and also universities involved, such as the IVEC in Venezuela. And this kind of coordination isn't easy. And if you just think about this slide, let me stop that. Just about this slide, the fact that it includes both the US government agency and a Venezuelan government agency, and they're working together, these days that's actually a fairly remarkable accomplishment. So there are diverse roles. Diverse roles that these different players are filling. So one of the zoos is doing rehabilitation education programs. An NGO, Conservation Society, is doing the field surveys as well as protecting habitat. The Smithsonian is providing research that is needed. Provita, an organization in Venezuela, an NGO there, is providing the coordination of all these efforts. And IVEC, an educational institution in Venezuela, is providing research on the distribution and the habitat. So this diagram just shows how these different organizations are contributing to different parts of the overall picture. And again, some of these arrows, I could have added more arrows to this, but this gives you some idea of complexity of the situation. And the coordination effort here is being jointly managed by Provita in Venezuela and the Smithsonian in the US. Of course, another great example of applying the one plan approach is from the Amphibian Arc with its partners with ASG and ASA and others, of working together to make sure that the ex situ programs, in situ programs, the various kinds of field research, other work that needs to be done is done in a coordinated. The amphibian groups probably could provide a model in cases just like the Siskin project did for other groups to follow. So in thinking about the one plan approach and the complexity I've been presenting, it might seem that all of this is more difficult and expensive than just doing your own project on your own within your own organization without worrying about what everybody else is doing. And I would argue that it's not more difficult than that. Species conservation is always difficult, otherwise there wouldn't be so many threatened species. And despite the fact that species conservation is difficult, we do have a lot of partners we can rely on. There are methods, tools, and especially other organizations with other kinds of expertise to help us achieve our goals. We don't have to do it all alone, or we don't need to do it all ourselves. So what are some of the tools available to help? So continuing from some of Christine's comments about that toolbox, first of all, there is a species conservation planning document produced by the IUCN SSC. There are other IUCN documents like the ex situ management plan, management for species conservation that Christine just talked about. There are reintroduction guidelines both from Amphibian ARC and the SSC. There are external facilitators that can help. There are red list assessment tools, prioritization tools, risk assessment tools, disease risk assessment tools, population management tools, adaptive management tools, and most importantly, your friends, or people that should become your friends. So that can help you take on some of these challenges. I'll step through a few of these. First of all, this is a species planning, strategic planning for species conservation handbook that was produced by the Species Conservation Commission. And if you're not already an expert in strategic planning for either organizations or projects or species conservation, it's probably worth you getting a copy of this and reading through it. It really steps through the many components that would be in an overall species conservation strategic plan. Christine already talked about IUCN guidelines on the use of ex-situ programs, so I don't need to go into that, but obviously you should take a look at that as well. And one thing that I think is underutilized are the manuals and the guidelines that are out there to help with disease risk assessments. And obviously, disease risk is a mature concern for amphibian programs with Chytrid and otherwise. And there are guidelines and manuals to help with careful evaluation of what the disease risk could be or any kind of conservation action you might undertake, whether it's translocation or otherwise. And these guidelines are available on the IUCN site and also on the CPSG site. Also, there's help available out there from the facilitation side to help bring the partners together, because that's often one of the most difficult things to do. That trying to bring partners together to create a one conservation plan, a one plan approach is a challenge. It's a facilitation challenge. And Conservation Planning Specialist Group is one of the groups that can help provide that facilitation. And this is just one of the examples from the Aruba Island National Conservation Planning Workshop that took place about a decade ago of CPSG facilitating, in this case for the country of Aruba, multi-species conservation planning. So what are the other kinds of software tools that might be available to help with this kind of planning? I'll point out that I probably emphasize this more than others might because it's my area of expertise, but you'll have to excuse me for that. There are pedigree analysis methods, there are population viability analysis methods, there are epidemiological models for modeling impacts of disease, and there are integrative models for helping you integrate across these different platforms. There are adaptive management modules available, and there are habitat models that are available. And as Christine and Luis mentioned, I work within a Species Conservation Toolkit Initiative that tries to provide these kinds of tools for conservation, provide training in them, and make them available to the world. This is just the website that we have. So from the population pedigree analysis and population management side, Christine mentioned the PMX program. And I'll point out that many of you might know about how PMX is used to select individuals for breeding, for managing genetics and demography of population. There are some parts of the PMX program that are not well known that might be especially important for planning translocations and reintroductions. So this is just an example of the fact that PMX can show you the genetic differences or similarities between any two subpopulations within your overall program. So this is just showing for a series of different breeding centers for some species, I don't remember what it was, a matrix of who's related to who. So you know which populations would be able to provide genetic support for others. It can also be used not just for captive populations, but even for looking at wild populations. So these are the data or the results from some analyses on golden white tamarin populations, comparing 4 different wild sites or isolated sites and looking at genetic divergence between them. And this kind of matrix can let you identify which populations need the most genetic help. And those would be the ones that on the diagonal of this matrix have large numbers. That means that they have high levels of inbreeding within the population or high mean kinships, and therefore they need genetic rescue in a sense. They can also help you identify where you should get the animals from to help restore genetic diversity within populations. And those would be the off-diagonal elements. So for example, if you identify that the BEN population needs to have more genetic diversity, and it does, the population that is least related to it is the BE population. So that would be the first choice as a place to get animals to translocate. You can also look at the same kind of results, not at a population level, but at an individual animal by animal level. This is a graph that's produced in the PMX program, again for golden lion tamarins, but looking at each tamarin in the zoos, whether it's a candidate for release into the wild. And the way it looks at it is to look at how valuable that animal is to the captive breeding program currently, and how valuable that animal would be to the wild population in terms of the genetic contributions. So for each point on this, each point's an animal, and the ones up in the upper left corner, the A quadrant, are individual animals that if they were reintroduced to the wild would boost the genetic diversity in the wild, whereas in the captive population, removing them from the captive population would be damaging to the captive population. So there are individuals that really need to stay home to keep the genetic diversity high in the captive population, although if they were released, they'd be good for the wild population. The lower right-hand corner are the ones that are the reverse of that. They're animals that would benefit the captive population if they stay within the captive population, but they actually would not do any benefit to the wild population because they'd be genetically redundant. They already have relatives in the wild population. The ones in the upper right-hand part are the ones we really want to focus on for the translocation or release program. Those are individuals that if you remove them from the captive population, it would help the genetic diversity in the captive population. They're overrepresented already. And if you put them into the wild population, it would help the genetic diversity of the wild population. They have underrepresented genetic material in the wild population. This is just a different way of looking at the same kind of information, but in this case, it's looking at California condors and saying to which site should each condor be released. So every set of 3 points connected by a line is showing for a given California condor chick in 1 year, how valuable it would be if it was released in Arizona to that population, how valuable it would be in Baja California if it's released there, and how valuable it would be to the released population in California. So if you look at the solid line illustrating one of the chicks, chick 172, you can see that it actually has the lowest genetic relationship to the Baja California population, and therefore that's where it should be released, rather than Arizona or possibly California. The converse situation is true of that dashed line, chick 49, in which it has high genetic relationship to Baja California. You don't want to release it there, but you do want to release it in California, where it has a low genetic relationship to the existing birds. So these analyses are done within the PMX program and can help you identify which individuals to release where. I will point out that you don't have to know all the mathematics behind this. The theory and the equations behind these kinds of calculations are in this book, as well as other sources. And in fact, soon there will be a condensed version of that book that skips over a lot of the complicated math and just gets to the primary points. Okay, Christine mentioned the need for, or the value of using population viability analyses or comprehensive analyses of what we know about a species, its environments, and human actions to project where it's heading long term. And there are a wide variety of forces acting on wildlife populations. So PVA program to look at the prospects for the recipient population. And you need to either do the kind of analysis that was done for the Allegheny wood rats of how well would the population do under different possible translocation programs, or as was mentioned, I think, after the talk yesterday, you might use an adaptive management approach where you really do not have the data to do a full assessment now. You do some experimental releases and track what happens, or you do both. So the kinds of questions that you need to answer whenever translocation is being contemplated, so before it's done, is assess the source population, how reliably can it provide the animals that are needed, and how quickly can it provide them at what time course, and an assessment of the recipient population, how many releases are needed, are they needed at all, over what time frame, and have all the risks of that program been assessed and managed. This just gives an example from whooping cranes, where a comprehensive conservation plan was developed for the captive populations, the reintroduced wild populations, and the one remaining original wild population. And these are the projections for different populations over time under a given management strategy that would restore populations in some areas over time, and then be able to shut off the reintroductions later after those populations were established. And this is a kind of integrated modeling of looking at all the populations at once that probably should be done in every case when translocation or reintroduction is contemplated. Okay, we know that isolated local populations can be in trouble for a variety of reasons. Loss of genetic variation, vulnerability to local catastrophes, just bad luck, as Christine mentioned. So in terms of a solution to the vulnerability of isolated populations, obviously one solution is you have more than one population so that it protects the populations and you from the kinds of catastrophes that can decimate a population. And of course, the other additional strategy that's needed is to connect those populations, make sure they're no longer so isolated. Either occasional transfers, translocations between populations to buffer, have each of them buffer the others, or periodic releases from a captive insurance population that might be managed to sustain high genetic variability. However, there are risks of doing these strategies, of using strategies such as that to sort of ameliorate the problems of isolated small populations. One risk is, of course, disease spread. If you move animals around, you might move disease. New arrivals are not always welcome, meaning it's sometimes hard socially to integrate released animals into wild populations. There could be social and ecological disruption of the local system, biological system. It can be costly, of course. It doesn't provide protection from regional catastrophes. Your local released populations are all in one local area. A single regional catastrophe, whether it's disease or weather-related or otherwise, might knock out all of them. And by setting up multiple populations and managing movement between them, you, of course, are going to require a lot of resources, and maybe you're spreading your resources too thin. You'd be better off focusing all those resources on one or a few populations. So what do we do to evaluate the pros and cons, get the right balance between whether we should be translocating animals or not and how many? Well, obviously, you need a comprehensive analysis that considers the multiple interaction processes. You need to use multiple tools and multiple kinds of expertise. And therefore, quite simply, you need to use a one-plan approach. I'll give you just one quick example, or not so quick example, of the way we can integrate different kinds of thinking in ways that help guide translocation and other strategies. Okay, let's consider the hypothetical population that's been split into 10 little subpopulations because of habitat fragmentation and loss. And we want to consider dispersal between those subpopulations, varying anywhere from no dispersal at all, no connectivity, to high connectivity that we might achieve through translocations. And we'll analyze these using the PVA model, population viability analysis projection, that considers the impact that inbreeding will have on the local populations. But we also want to consider the possibility that moving animals around between populations can be a way that a mechanism that spreads disease between those populations. So it could be a risk to the populations. So consider the possibility that a fatal disease already exists in some of these subpopulations. The question becomes, is connectivity good or bad? Should we be translocating animals or not? The geneticists would almost always say yes, move animals around, move a lot of them around to avoid the genetic problems. The disease experts, the veterinarians, will say, no, don't move them around because you're at risk of spreading the disease if you do so. So the question is, who's right? Well, to explore that for one hypothetical case, we use the outbreak disease model, which explores or projects the dynamics of disease as it moves through a wildlife population. And this is just one example of some modeling that was done on chytrid, the Panamanian golden frog, how rapidly it could move through a population, how many it would kill. And we used the program METAMODEL manager to connect the outbreak model to the vortex model. We could simultaneously model the genetics and also model disease processes. So this slide shows for projecting different rates of movements between the subpopulations, what would happen if there is no disease in the system, and we simply look at the genetic benefits of moving animals around. And what it shows is the solid line is what if we don't move anybody, all the way up to the top line if we move a lot of individuals per generation. And what you can see is the expected outcome that genetics would always argue for, which is that if you move more animals around, you avoid inbreeding accumulation, and therefore the population thrives. This slide shows, in contrast, what would happen if inbreeding was not a problem, but disease is a problem. That is, what happens if there are infectious diseases that could spread between the populations, but we don't really worry about genetic problems. And what this shows is what the wildlife veterinarians would always tell us, which is that if you don't move animals around, you protect the subpopulations from disease spread. That's the top line. And if you do move them around, you can rapidly spread that disease among the subpopulations, leading to population decimation and loss of many more subpopulations. But the reality is that both of these things are likely happening. There is a risk of disease spread, there is a risk of inbreeding, and there are other risks that we also need to build into these models. Well, we have ways to combine those analyses, combine the thinking of the veterinarians with the thinking of the geneticists to come up with a more comprehensive solution. And what this slide shows, and I won't give the details, is the modeling that was done that considered both the genetic and the disease risks simultaneously. What you find is that trade-offs change over time. Over the short term, you're better off without any dispersal. Keep the populations isolated so you don't cause the disease to spread between the populations. Over the long term, that's a bad strategy because the populations become inbred. Your better strategy is to move the animals around to prevent that inbreeding from occurring in the local populations. Interestingly, in the midterm, around 25 to 30 year time span for this species, your best strategy is to have some connectivity, some movement, but not too much. So enough to counter some of the inbreeding effects, but not so much that you rapidly spread diseases around. So the trade-offs between disease management and genetic management change over time. And this is the kind of subtle outcome that we need to explore before we dive into planning a translocation or reintroduction strategy. So just to wrap up, point out we do have means, models for tackling the complex multidisciplinary challenges for implementing a one-plan approach. And some of those methods, those means, really involve good coordination with facilitation between diverse partners. And we need more methods. And it's not easy to do, but it is necessary if we're going to succeed in conservation. The take-home message would be, don't do this alone. I don't know of any expert out there in conservation who knows all the different fields that are necessary, veterinary, genetics, field biology, etc., to do a good job on their own of planning for species conservation. And therefore, it's good to have friends, and it's necessary to collaborate with them to have conservation success. In terms of just where we are in terms of possible questions, I'll throw a question out to you, all of you, which is to ask for why an emphasis on one plan approach is so important, especially in the consideration of translocations and reintroductions, even more so perhaps than in other kinds of conservation strategies. I'm not sure whether all this came through in terms of possible internet connections and all that, but I'll try to turn it back over to Luis to see what questions people might have.